Hello, dear members of the Drama of Life family. Today we will bring you an emotional love story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any meaningful stories. Ethan Walker stood in front of a cracked mirror on the wall, adjusting the collar of his faded white shirt. His fingers trembled slightly from both the tension and the cold that seeped through the old windows. The small room, which was a living room and bedroom, was filled with the gray light of a bleak winter morning. The low whine of an old heater was the background to the heavy silence. He glanced at his worn watch, the second hand still ticking silently, reminding him that today was no ordinary day. Today was the day of his interview with Bennett Industries, the largest corporation in the city, where a job there could change his life. Ethan's brown eyes, usually sparkling with hope, were filled with unspoken worry. The failed interviews he had received were like invisible scars on his heart. Every time he received a rejection letter, he had to stand before his mother, force a smile, and pretend that everything was okay, that there was still hope. But he knew that time was running out. A dry cough came from the old bed in the corner of the room. Ethan turned around, his eyes soft as he looked at his thin mother huddled under the thin blanket. Her gray hair covered half of her haggard face. Chronic lung disease was slowly taking away her vitality, day by day. Ethan moved closer and sat down on the edge of the bed. He gently took his mother's dry hand, the hand that had once held and comforted him during his childhood, now so fragile that it seemed like a single gust of wind could blow it away. "Mom," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking in the quiet, "I'll find a job. I promise." He leaned down and placed a kiss on his mother's forehead, where the faint warmth still lingered. His mother stirred slightly in her sleep, a dreamy smile forming at the corner of her mouth as if she had heard his promise, even in the depths of her sleep. Ethan stood up, trying to swallow the lump in his throat. He turned back to the small mirror, straightening the hem of his shirt again. The shirt, the only decent piece of clothing he had left from his school days, was now worn, the collar fraying. He picked up the application, wrapped in a torn plastic cover. Inside was a resume, printed many times, the paper yellowed and smudged with pencil marks. Ethan knew it wasn't perfect, but it was all he had. With a deep breath, he pulled on a light jacket, stuffed the files into his pocket, and stepped out of the apartment. The rickety wooden door closed behind him with a heavy creak. Outside, the cold wind whipped Ethan's face, but he didn't flinch. He knew how slim the chances were today. A small blemish could knock him off the candidate list. But he also knew that if he didn't do his best today, there would be no tomorrow for him and his mother. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the image of his mother appeared in his mind. He remembered the sleepless nights caring for her, the times he had to refuse meals to save money for medicine, the dreams of a small house warm enough for his mother to live out her final years in peace. And it was those memories that pushed him forward, step by step. Despite the bone-chilling cold, despite the doubts, despite the fear that smoldered in his heart. At just 24 years old, Ethan Walker had spent the past year stuck in a cycle of job applications and rejection letters. With his mother's health rapidly deteriorating, today's interview at Bennett Industries felt like his last chance to change both of their lives. He wore his only decent dress shirt and carried a shabby portfolio. Ethan pulled up the collar of his thin jacket, bracing himself against the bitter wind that whistled past the tall buildings. His battered motorcycle groaned in complaint as he revved the throttle through the crowded downtown streets. His insides were as tight as an overtuned guitar string, each minute a pounding beat of his heart. In his mind, Ethan tried to rehearse common interview questions. "Can you tell us about your strengths?" Зрение. Почему вы хотите работать в Bennett Industries? Swing. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? He whispered the answer into the air, trying to memorize every word, every idea, like a student before an exam that would determine his future. The twists and turns on the road could not stop his wandering thoughts and intense concentration. He knew clearly, this was not just an interview, this was a chance for survival. The wheels of the motorbike bounced as Ethan drove over a small pothole. He gritted his teeth and tightened his grip on the handlebars, his eyes scanning the chaotic lines of people and vehicles fighting for every inch of the road. Every red light, every traffic jam was like an invisible trap, pulling him further away from his destination. But then, like a slap from fate, The sharp sound of metal clashing rang out right in front. Ethan was startled and slammed on the brakes so hard that the wheels skidded across the road. A few feet away, a sight made his blood run cold. A young woman in her early 20s lay motionless on the sidewalk. Her hair was spread out in a black smudge across the cold concrete, and blood pooled bright red beneath her head. A crowd began to gather, whispers, stares, but no one really did anything. Ethan stood still for a second, his heart filled with panic and conflict. Two thoughts were fighting fiercely in his head. If I stop, I'll be late for the interview. I'll lose my last chance. What about my mom? If I don't stop, how can I look at myself in the mirror? One heartbeat, one decisive moment. Without hesitation, Ethan threw the motorbike to the side of the road. He rushed to the girl's side, knelt down, and checked her breathing. She was still breathing, but very weakly, and blood was continuously flowing from the wound on her head. "Everyone call a taxi!" Ethan shouted, his voice carrying like an order over the silent crowd. Luckily, a shiny yellow taxi had just turned the corner. Ethan waved hard, then carefully and gently picked the woman up, avoiding further injury. The taxi driver, initially hesitant, but upon seeing Ethan's determined and desperate face, hurriedly opened the car door. Ethan jumped into the car, placed the girl on his lap, and kept her head slightly elevated to minimize further injury. When they arrived at the nearest hospital, Ethan did not hesitate to sign all the paperwork to take temporary care of this strange girl, despite having only a few dollars in his pocket. St. Mary's was filled with cold white light, and hurried footsteps echoed through the long hallways. Ethan stood there, lost in the crowd of people in white coats, his hands still stained with the girl's dried blood on his shirt sleeve. Anxiety weighed heavily on his chest, and he kept glancing at the closed emergency room door. With each passing second, Ethan felt like a rock was pressing down on his shoulders. He held the old phone with trembling hands, his eyes glued to the blank screen as if waiting for a color to appear. But there were no messages, no missed calls from Bennett Industries. And time continued to pass. He turned to the nurse who had just emerged from the emergency room. Her face was tense, but her eyes were gentle. "Is she okay?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. "We're doing everything we can," the nurse assured. "Are you related?" Ethan hesitated. He didn't know her name, knew nothing about her beyond the blood and pale face he'd seen when he'd found her. But he nodded. "Yes, I'll take care of her." Those words, spoken so firmly, made Ethan feel like he had just signed some kind of invisible contract. He knew he couldn't abandon this girl, even if the price might be his own future. He sat down on the stiff waiting chair, his hands clutching the hem of his shirt. His breathing was heavy, his eyes closed as if in prayer. He replayed what had just happened in his mind. The sound of the collision, the blood on the pavement, the panicked eyes of the crowd. If he had left at that moment, who would have saved her? Time seemed to slow down. Each click of boots on the hallway floor echoed in his ears like the ticking of a time bomb. Ethan didn't dare look at his watch. He knew that somewhere the interview had begun or even ended, but he couldn't leave, not while she was still fighting for her life. Finally, after long, stressful hours, a middle-aged doctor with a tired face pushed open the emergency room door and walked out. "She'll be fine," he said, his voice soft. "Just a concussion and some blood loss. We stopped the bleeding in time. Thank you for getting her here so quickly." A wave of relief washed over Ethan. His legs felt weak, but his heart pounded with gratitude. He leaned his head against the wall and let out a long breath, feeling as if the world had just let him go after a terrible storm. But just then, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Ethan pulled it out, his hands shaking. A message appeared on the screen, short and cold. "Your interview has been canceled due to no show." Ethan stood still, as if someone had sucked the air out of him. A pang of disappointment filled his chest, bitter and heavy. He stared at the words, then closed his eyes slightly. Maybe he lost his chance to change his life. Maybe he lost everything he had worked for over the past year. But when he thought of the young woman, of that crucial moment, Ethan knew he wouldn't have done anything differently if he had to choose again. He had done the right thing, and somehow, that was more important. 3 days later, under the scorching city sun, Ethan was doing a job he never thought he'd have to do again. Working as a porter at a construction site. His shirt was torn at the shoulders. His jeans were stained with cement. Ethan's hands were calloused and his fingertips were bleeding. Every step he took was heavy, his spine aching as if it was about to break under the weight of the 50-kilogram bag of cement on his shoulder. But he didn't complain. Ethan needed the small amount of money to buy medicine for his mother and pay the rent he owed. Despite his frustration and exhaustion, he held a quiet pride in himself. He was doing it with his own two hands. Sweat streamed down Ethan's temples, mixing with the dust, making his face blurry. He paused for a moment, put the cement bag down on the dry, cracked ground, and wiped his forehead with his hand. Just then, the low rumble of an engine echoed through the noisy construction site. Ethan raised his head, frowning as he saw a shiny black SUV slowly approaching, standing out among the old trucks and rusty machinery. The car stopped close to the barrier. The door opened decisively. A man in a neat black suit stepped down, tall. His sharp eyes scanned the area before stopping at Ethan. The man walked straight towards him without hesitation, holding a thin iPad and a thick envelope in his hand. "Ethan Walker?" he asked, his voice clear and professional. Ethan blinked, not believing that the handsome man was asking him. He looked down at his dirty appearance, then hesitantly nodded. "Yes, it's me." The man smiled slightly as if he had confirmed that he had the right person. He held out a white business card, printed with the name Charles Grant, personal assistant to Sophie Bennett. Ethan stuttered, his mind reeling at the name. Sophie Bennett. The image of the bloody young girl lying on the sidewalk that day flashed through his mind, along with the sound of an ambulance siren and a feeling of suffocating fear. He could not have imagined that the girl he had saved was Sophie Bennett, a famous name in the business world, the only daughter of Bennett Industries, the corporation Ethan had hoped to join. Charles Grant continued, his tone polite but weighty. "Miss Bennett is very grateful to you for what you have done. She would like to see you in person." Ethan stood frozen, the bag of cement temporarily forgotten at his feet. The curious gazes of the surrounding workers burned into his back. His heart pounded in his chest, surprised and alarmed. He couldn't understand why someone like Sophie Bennett would want to see a nobody like him, a jobless, dirty, failed guy. But somewhere deep in my heart, a small ray of hope began to burn. Maybe, just maybe, the world still has another way for him. Ethan followed Charles Grant through the large glass doors of a luxurious building in the heart of the city. The main hall was lined with pure white marble slabs. Crystal lights from the high ceiling shone down, creating shimmering halos on the polished floor. He felt out of place in his old work clothes, his cement-dusted shoes squeaking on the floor. Among the well-dressed waiters and well-dressed guests, Ethan was an outsider. Charles led him into a private elevator. No one spoke all the way to the top floor. The elevator doors opened, leading to a dark wood-paneled hallway, the faint scent of cedar wafting through the air. At the end of the hallway, Ethan saw a living room, a light-filled space with soft leather sofas, modern art on the walls, and white silk curtains swaying in the breeze from the balcony. Ethan paused in the doorway, hesitant as if his mere presence would sully the delicate space. He reached up to adjust his collar, feeling a cold sweat break out on his back. Light footsteps sounded. Ethan raised his head and met Sophie's eyes. The girl he had saved that day now looked much more radiant. Her golden hair was neatly tied back, her skin glowing under the sunlight streaming through the large windows. Even though her leg was still in a soft splint around her ankle, Sophie walked with an easy confidence, her eyes bright and her warm smile lighting up the room. She wore a light pastel dress, not too much makeup, but still exuded an irresistible, delicate beauty. "Ethan," she said, her voice as light as the spring breeze, "thank you. Thank you for not turning your back that day." Ethan was confused and could only shake his head. "I just did what anyone should do." Sophie smiled, stepping closer to him. "I owe you more than you think," she said. And then, without beating around the bush, Sophie dropped a bomb that left Ethan speechless. She is Sophie Bennett, the daughter of Richard Bennett, the powerful CEO of Bennett Industries, the very company Ethan once dreamed of joining and missed his chance. Ethan felt his heart tighten. Part of him couldn't believe that fate had brought him to this moment. Part of him was filled with regret. He could have entered the company on his own, if not for that incident. Sophie, with sincere eyes, gently suggested, "If you want, I can arrange a position for you at Bennett Industries. Not out of pity, but because I believe you deserve a chance." Ethan clenched his hands in front of his stomach, his eyes downcast. Part of him wanted to nod, to save his mother, to have a fresh start. But deep down, his pride, the thing that had sustained him through all those difficult months, wouldn't let him. He raised his head, met Sophie's hopeful eyes, and smiled slowly. "I appreciate it, but I want to take the opportunity myself. I don't want charity." The air in the room seemed to freeze in that moment, as Ethan asserted his dignity and dream with all humility and determination. Sophie stepped forward, her eyes shining with a mixture of mischief and sincerity. From her small side pocket, she pulled out an ivory-white business card, printed with delicate handwriting. Before Ethan could say goodbye, Sophie gently slipped the card into his hand. "Even if you don't want to help," she said, her voice like a small bell ringing in the quiet room, "maybe we can be friends." Ethan looked down at his hand, where the card lay, as if it were something both foreign and precious. His fingers tightened, careful as if afraid to damage the fragile card. A sudden feeling of warmth welled up in Ethan's heart, a feeling he had long forgotten, after months of hardship living only for duty and obligation. He raised his head, meeting Sophie's gaze on him, not forcing it, simply a sincere invitation. Ethan nodded slightly, not promising anything, not sure about the future. But deep down he hoped that fate once again would give them the chance to meet again. The following days passed in Ethan's usual hectic pace. He still rose at dawn, working hard at the construction site with calloused hands, trying to push away the thoughts of that strange encounter. He told himself not to expect anything more, but his heart still fluttered every now and then when he saw the small business card carefully tucked away in his wallet. Then a surprise message came. "Hey, Ethan, do you know how to unjam the printer? I'm struggling here." It was Sophie, short, witty, and completely casual. No invitations or hints of status, just two friends. Ethan laughed, then texted back the instructions. He didn't think much of it, but a few days later there was another text, a silly joke about a cat and a coffee maker. And so their communication continued naturally, without any pressure. Sophie never mentioned the rescue or the fact that Ethan had turned down the opportunity. She was simply Sophie, vibrant, funny, a little awkward, but sincere. Ethan also gradually felt comfortable. When he answered her, he no longer felt like he was talking to a rich young lady, but just a friend who was looking for some normalcy in her complicated world. Gradually, naturally, a bond developed between them, not based on duty or guilt, but on genuine respect. Ethan's life was as steady as the hammering at a construction site. He sought nothing but peace, but somewhere deep inside, Sophie's messages planted a silent longing in him that he didn't even realize. Then one afternoon, as Ethan was packing up his gear, his phone rang. "Are you free tonight?" The message popped up with a tiny coffee cup icon. Ethan's heart clenched, not so much with excitement as with hesitation. Would it be wise to enter Sophie's world, even for just one evening? But then, looking at his calloused hands and thinking of his unadorned conversations with her, he decided to take a chance. The venue Sophie chose was not some flashy five-star restaurant, as Ethan had feared. Instead, it was a tiny cafe on the top floor of an old building, draped in soft yellow string lights, with a sweeping view of the glittering city skyline. Ethan arrived early, wearing the simplest shirt he owned, the same one he'd worn for the interview. He leaned against the railing, taking deep breaths, until he heard the soft click of clogs on the old tiles. Sophie appeared in a soft wool dress, her dark brown hair loose and natural. No expensive jewelry, no elaborate makeup, just Sophie, down to earth and genuine. She smiled when she saw him, and Ethan smiled back, a smile so natural that he surprised himself. They chose a small corner table where the soft light shone on the steaming cup of coffee and the fragrant, crispy toast. There are no forced formalities, just simple stories. Sophie tells of her overprotective childhood, of the constant pressure to be the perfect daughter in front of the media and corporate executives. Her eyes darkened at the thought of the lavish parties she was forced to attend, the cold handshakes and fake smiles. Ethan, sitting quietly listening, sensed the deep loneliness behind her confident exterior. In turn, he talked about his childhood years with a single mother, about the hard manual labor he had to do to make a living, and the feeling of helplessness as he watched his mother get weaker and weaker without being able to do more. Sophie didn't blink, didn't interrupt, just listened quietly, as if every word he said had weight. That simple dinner of simple pasta and garlic bread seemed better than any lavish party they had ever attended. Their laughter rang out into the night, real and warm, erasing any invisible distance between two very different worlds. Ethan found himself looking at Sophie longer than usual, realizing she wasn't the cold, spoiled heiress he'd thought she was. She has her own cracks, her own dreams, and a burning desire to be herself. And in Sophie's eyes, Ethan was no longer just a construction worker with tanned hands. He was a man of rare strength, honesty, and compassion, something she rarely saw in her glamorous but empty world. As night fell, the city lights below them twinkling like distant stars, they both knew they had found something more precious than they ever thought possible. None of them wanted the night to end. A week after that evening, Ethan received a surprise phone call from Sophie. "Can you come see me for a moment?" Her voice on the other end of the phone line was both gentle and strangely nervous. Without hesitation, Ethan dropped everything and drove across the city to the address she sent. It wasn't a fancy office building, nor a grand mansion. It was a small, cozy space, a newly renovated coffee shop with exposed brick walls and warm yellow lighting. Sophie, in a loose shirt and simple jeans, stood in the middle of the empty room with a hopeful smile. "I've been thinking for a long time," she began, her hands clasped together in excitement. "I don't want to continue living a life just to please others. I want to start over, with things I truly love." She turned to a corner of the room where a wooden board with the scrawled words, "The Rooftop Cafe," was placed. "I bought this place. I want to turn it into a little cafe where people can come, relax, and feel like they can be themselves. And," she hesitated, her cheeks flushing slightly, "I want you to help me." Ethan was stunned. Part of him still whispered caution, that their worlds were too different. But looking into Sophie's eyes, he saw only sincerity, longing, and trust. Not pity, not grace, but it is a real invitation to build something beautiful from the ground up. Ethan stepped forward, his calloused hands grasping her small one. "I will help you," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "but only if you agree to one thing." Sophie tilted her head, eyes shining in the yellow light. "What?" "We will build it together. No one is behind anyone." A bright smile spread across her face, a smile no longer hidden, no longer hesitant. "Agree." And every evening, as the city lights twinkled beneath them, they sat together, sipping coffee and whispering about the dreams that lay ahead.